Tucker Carlson is back on air after suddenly leaving Fox News. The former primetime host has now launched the first episode of his new Twitter-based show. It was just 10 minutes long, but in that time, Carlson managed to take on Ukraine, what really happened with 9/11, and who killed JFK. What was the theme? As you can potentially guess, the mainstream media are there to deceive American citizens who Carlson described as, quote, the least informed in the world. And the audience loved it. Less than 24 hours after its release, the show had been viewed more than 75 million times. That is an impressive figure. There was one claim of Carlson's, though, that particularly caught our attention.
In journalism, curiosity is the gravest crime. Yesterday, for example, a former Air Force officer who worked for years in military intelligence came forward as a whistleblower to reveal that the U.S. government has physical evidence of crashed non-human-made aircraft, as well as the bodies of the pilots who flew those aircraft. The Pentagon has spent decades studying these otherworldly remains in order to build more technologically advanced weapons systems. Okay, that's what the former intel officer revealed, and it was clear he was telling the truth. In other words, UFOs are actually real, and apparently so is extraterrestrial life. Now we know. In a normal country, this news would qualify as a bombshell, the story of the millennium. But in our country, it doesn't. The whistleblower's account ran on a technology website called The Debrief, which you've probably never heard of. The Washington Post had that story, but decided not to run it. The New York Times, meanwhile, just pretended it never happened. On the front page of the New York Times website this morning, there were 5 stories about Ukraine, as well as 4 stories apiece about Donald Trump, trans people, and climate change, the usual lineup. There was nothing at all about how an alien species is flying hypersonic aircraft over our cities.
He didn't qualify himself very much. It was very clear. He says it was clear the whistleblower was telling the truth. He says UFOs are actually real, and he says, now we know. Now we know. There are aliens using hypersonic missiles or flying in hypersonic spaceships over us, and the Americans keeping it secret. Is he correct? Do we now know? Well, let's take a look at the evidence. So this is the story Carlson is referring to. It's largely based on the testimony of a single whistleblower from within the US intelligence community. David Charles Grush was an intelligence officer for over 14 years. He was involved in the Unidentified Anomalous Phenomena Task Force between 2019 and 2022. Unidentified Anomalous Phenomena, or UAP, is the new term for UFOs. That task force was a secret until 2020. Grush has now handed a dossier of confidential documents to the US Congress. And according to him, the files show that deeply covert US programs, quote, possess retrieved, intact, and partially intact craft of non-human origin. Grush has also appeared on US channel News Nation, where he went into some detail about how he came to have this information.
The UAP task force was refused access to a broad crash retrieval program.
When you say crash retrieval, what do you mean?
These are retrieving non-human origin technical vehicles, call it spacecraft if you will, non-human, exotic origin vehicles that have either landed or crashed.
We have spacecraft from another species.
We do, yeah.
How many?
Quite a number.
You're kidding.
No. I thought it was totally nuts, and I thought at first I was being deceived. It was a ruse. People started confiding in me. They approached me. I have plenty of current and former senior intelligence officers that came to me, many of which I knew almost my whole career, that confided in me they were a part of a program. They named the program. I've never heard of it. And they told me, based on their oral testimony, and they provided me documents and other proof, that there was, in fact, a program that the UAP task force was not read into.
So Grush doesn't claim to have seen any of these crafts himself, and according to the Debrief article, his account is based on, quote, extensive interviews with high-level intelligence officials. So that doesn't sound exactly like an open and shut case. I wouldn't quite say we know. Nonetheless, he was prepared to offer up a little more detail in that interview.
You are saying to the human race, for the first time, an official intelligence representative at a high level from the US government is saying publicly, we are not alone.
We're definitely not alone. Absolutely, the data points empirically that we're not alone, yeah.
Do we have bodies? Do we have species of
Well,
non-human?
naturally, when you recover something that's either landed or crashed, sometimes you encounter dead pilots. And believe it or not, as fantastical as that sounds, it's true.
I've got to be blunt about this. You're not making this up. This is not a lie.
No, absolutely not.
Because everybody watching this right now is looking at your face.
Mm-hmm.
They're going, is this guy for real?
I am for real. And I'm sitting here at great personal risk and obvious professional risk by talking to you today.
I mean, that is obvious professional risk. The pilots are sometimes there. Remember, he's saying he hasn't seen this. This is just other people telling him. According to Grush, he's faced retaliation from the US government since going public. So is the guy reliable? The debrief article gives a number of other quotes from intelligence and military officials, all vouching for him. And he isn't the only insider to come forward saying that aliens are real and that we know about them. Jonathan Gray is an intelligence officer working in the National Air and Space Intelligence Center. He told the debrief this: the existence of complex historical programs involving the coordinated retrieval and study of exotic materials dating back to the early 20th century should no longer remain a secret. The majority of retrieved foreign exotic materials have a prosaic terrestrial explanation and origin, but not all. And any number higher than 0 in this category represents an undeniably significant statistical percentage. The non-human intelligence phenomenon is real. We are not alone. Retrievals of this kind are not limited to the United States. This is a global phenomenon, and yet a global solution continues to elude us. Grush's account is just the latest in a series of revelations about UAPs or UFOs. In 2020, a New York Times article penned by the same journalists who wrote the debrief story confirmed the existence of the Unidentified Aerial Phenomenon Task Force. Pentagon officials still refuse to discuss the program. And before that 2020 revelation, back in 2017, the New York Times and the Washington Post revealed this footage, apparently showing encounters between Navy jets and UAPs.
Dude, that is a fucking drone, bro. There's a whole fleet of them. Look on the ASA. My gosh. They're all going against the wind. The wind's 120 knots to the west. Look at that thing, dude. That's not an LNS though, is it? It's not. That is an LNS, dude. Well, if there's like... Look at that thing. It's rotating. Nickel 6-1 Tango, Roger, over. Oh, got it! Woohoo! Roger, there's troubleshooting as soon as I get... Are you box moving target? 02. No, I took an auto track. Oh, okay. Oh my gosh, dude. Wow, look at that, man. Look at it fly.
Just last week, NASA held its first ever public meeting to discuss what information they have on UAPs. That's where they released this footage.
This is an example of one that I showed at the hearing recently. This is a spherical orb, metallic, in the Middle East, 2022, by an MQ-9. I will come back to the sensor question that David raised here in a moment. This is a typical example of the thing that we see most of. We see these all over the world, and we see these in making very interesting apparent maneuvers.
James, I feel like we're potentially both a little bit out of our, areas of expertise here. Do you buy this idea that the Americans might have found alien life, which crashed into the Earth and then kept it a secret because they wanted to use the technology for weapons?
Broadly speaking, no, I don't think the US is secretly hiding evidence of crashed alien spaceships. The guy doing the whistleblower here, I mean, presumably he's sincere about what he's heard, but big organizations, particularly big secretive organizations where people actually have quite a premium and not really talking to each other and hiding what they're doing, which is what the US intelligence establishments looks like, they generate rumors, they generate people talking about stuff, and you can collate all of these things, write it all down, and suddenly you can look like you've got a story. He hasn't seen these things himself. It's all based in sort of hearsay. So that's where we are with that. I thought Phil Burton Cartledge, who writes a very good blog called All That Is Solid, had a decent take on this, which is like, well, look, whatever the sort of truth about these kind of stories bubbling up and the way they function, in practice, they tend to act as something of a distraction from a whole bunch of other things that we could be talking about. That we end up sort of saying, oh, well, there's a grand conspiracy that's secretly plotting away to make the world look different to how it is, rather than seeing the things that are right in front of our faces: rising price of food and profiteering by food companies, and some practical, obvious things that are there in our day-to-day lives that you can see, and that you can see who's responsible for it. And this is what we need to go and think about. Instead, you've got this sort of, frankly, it looks like a bit of a distraction where you sort of say, okay, the US is hiding alien space technology somewhere in Area 51 or wherever these places are. It just doesn't seem very likely. And I think we have to be a bit careful around some of these sort of conspiracy theory end of things.
You'll be pleased to know we're probably not going to devote too many of our shows to extraterrestrial life and keep to the more terrestrial problems you speak to there. Because we don't talk about it very often, though, let's entertain this for a little while. They have these programs and they are secret, which is interesting in and of itself, right? The fact that there was a secret Pentagon program, which they weren't going public about UFOs, doesn't mean there were UFOs and they were covering it up. But it does suggest that were they to find unidentified flying objects, whatever we call them now, they probably do want to know first, and they probably want to do a lot of research before they tell anyone else. So potentially we should, as a society, think about what would we want to do were something to land here. Do we trust this secret Pentagon department to sort it all out? Because there probably are aliens out there, right? I mean, the universe is big enough. I would imagine there probably are.
Not necessarily. I mean, this is the old Fermi paradox, isn't it? That look, if the universe is so big, and it is really big, then you'd expect there to be lots and lots of life out there. You'd expect the place to be teeming. And there's billions of stars, right? At least some of those have planets around them that could support life, and therefore we should already have seen evidence of aliens, because it's a really big universe. So you should already have seen it, and yet we find nothing. So it's really quite eerie that there's so little evidence. This is the Fermi paradox. There's so little evidence of extraterrestrial life out there. Now, what we're dealing with the US military and the intelligence establishment, frankly, yes, they do. Of course, they have a unit to investigate unidentified flying objects, or whatever they're now calling it. By the way, they changed the name to get away from the little green men sort of association of UFOs. That actually what they're concerned about is things like the Chinese weather balloon from a few months back. You know, that other countries out there are developing technologies that they want to keep an eye on. And that's why this takes this military edge. It's not really the visitors from the other world that should worry us. It's the fact that we live in a system where you have very large, very powerful countries that bump into each other, that compete with each other, and that competition takes a military form. And that's what you're seeing here. That's why the US military takes an interest in this stuff, more so than any concern that they have about, you know, visitors from the stars or whatever it might be.